This video is brought to you with the support of TrueFire. Learn, practice, and play with TrueFire. Hi, this is Keith Williams. Welcome to 5 Watt World. We're interested in helping you get the most music from the least gear. It's 1980, and it's looking pretty bleak over at Fender Musical Instruments. The boom time of the mid-60s to mid-70s are over, and copies of vintage Fenders are flooding the market from overseas. And to add insult to injury, these copies are often better made than the guitars that are coming out of Fullerton. Enter Fender Japan. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe or grab a t-shirt, hoodie, hat, or a Stomp preset pack to support what we do. And to become a bigger part of 5 Watt World, sign up for the Friends of 5 Watt on Patreon. There's a friend level to suit any budget. The links are in the description. CBS bought Fender Musical Instruments in 1965 and rode the post-British invasion and post-Woodstock wave for 10 years, selling designs tweaked from the past without much thought to the future. CBS made a lot of money during those years and had invested very little of it back into the company. By 1980, the money had stopped rolling in on its own, and they realized that something had to be done. CBS turned to the competition and hired Bill Schultz away from Yamaha's Musical Instruments American division as Fender's new president, and that August they also brought on Dan Smith as the new director of marketing. Smith and Schultz led the charge back to quality versions of the vintage designs. They moved back to the original headstock shapes and a 4-bolt neck plate. To do this took some radical thinking. They nearly shut down the factory and worked to reteach everyone there how to build the guitars that the musicians wanted. Output fell from 250 to 300 guitars a day to just a handful while every aspect of the production was examined. During the latter half of 1981, Dan Smith and senior engineer for R&D Dan Page did an in-depth research project to produce replicas of several old guitars and basses. The series featured a 57 and a 62 Stratocaster, a 57 and a 62 Precision bass, a 62 Jazz bass, and a 52 Telecaster. All of these were launched at the January '82 NAMM show, and production began shortly after. After at least a decade of eroding quality at Fender, high-quality copies of Fender guitars were being produced in Japan. Particularly those built by Tokai and Greco were gaining a reputation for being the equal to or better than current Fender production. Despite advancement at Fender during '81, they couldn't compete with the government-subsidized production and favorable exchange rates pricing of the guitars coming from Japan. Many of these were outright copies of Fender designs, but were cheaper to produce. So the new management at Fender decided it was time to find an offshore production source for less expensive guitars for the overseas markets, and eventually for the US market as well. By March of '82, this "if you can't beat 'em, join 'em" strategy led to the formation of Fender Japan. It was created by forming an alliance with two Japanese distributors, Kanda Shokai and Yamano Music. These companies had been commissioning the copies of Fender guitars to be sold in Japan, but under this new agreement, they would now sell Fender licensed and labeled guitars built right there in Japan. Specifically, Kanda Shokai owned the Greco brand. The creation of Fender Japan meant that the Greco copies of Fender guitars would no longer be produced. So with one swift move, Fender was able to open a new market for overseas Fender sales and remove a major competitor at the same time. It was decided that the Fender Japan guitars would be built by FujiGen Gakki. The word Gakki simply means musical instruments, so don't let it confuse you when folks are talking about different companies across this history. FujiGen had been producing the high-quality Greco copies, and now Fender USA provided them with vintage examples to work from. The craftsmen at FujiGen had over 20 years head start on the workmen back in Fullerton when it came to copying the classic Fender models. So when the new FujiGen copies were shown to the folks at the factory in the US, they were gobsmacked. They could not believe the level of detail that these Japanese workmen had been able to produce. The workers in the US were awed by the quality, and by some accounts, this lit a fire under the team in California, just when they were learning how to build guitars from scratch. This was such a pivotal point in Fender's history, I think you can argue that by inspiring a new level of quality at the US plant, the guitars from Fender Japan helped save the Fender Company worldwide. The guitars were built in the FujiGen Gakki factory in Matsumoto, Japan. The designs included the best of Leo's pre-CBS guitars, right up through the Paisley Tellies, and somewhat bizarrely included some of the early 70s Fender designs that were so looked down upon in the States. These were vintage-style instruments. There was a 52 Telly, a 57 and a 62 style reissue Strat, a P-Bass, and a Jazz Bass that came out that May. Soon after, they also issued a TL62, a bound reissue Telly custom style from the 60s. The early serial numbers had the prefix JV, which stood for Japanese Vintage, and would run from 82 to 84. As such, they coincided with the reissues being built in the Fender factory in Fullerton. These guitars were very close to the original 50s and 60s guitars. Unlike the early reissues for Fender USA, where the US had one reissue, the Fender Japan folks had 3 different levels. So there were 3 different 57 Strat models, for example, with different feature sets. These were at 3 price points, and this was incorporated into their model numbers: the ST5765, the ST5785, and the ST57-115. These suffixes were the price in thousands of yen, so the ST57-65 sold for 65,000 yen, and so on. As the prices changed over time, the suffixes of the models would also change. The first Fender Japan catalog issued in '82 was simply a reprint of the Fender USA catalog, translated into Japanese. So the first real Fender Japan catalog that outlined the 3 different level tiers was issued in '83. The highest priced guitars, the 115s, paralleled the specs of the Fullerton reissues. They included complete US-built wiring harnesses and pickups, pots, vibrato block, and a nitro lacquer finish, all of the features of the US Fullerton reissue guitars built from '82 to '84. But an interesting footnote is that the neck carbs of the Fender Japan guitars are closer to the original 50s and 60s necks than are the Fullerton reissues. These were the highest level guitar, but they are also very, very few built and still around today. Finally, the entry-level 65 guitars are still great guitars. The tone woods are the same, but there are Japanese-made pickups based on the American counterparts with black fiber bobbins and staggered Alnico magnets along with plastic cover wiring. To tell what model tier an early Fender Japan guitar is, look in the neck pocket. The highest tier were stamped A, the middle tier B, and the base models were stamped C. Unlike the Strats, the Telecaster came in only 2 model tiers. They all had a JV serial number. JV stood for Japanese Vintage, as I said, and these earliest JV serial number guitars are generally seen as the most desirable, though the overall quality of the guitars from Fender Japan have been consistent through the decades. The serial numbers appeared on the Telly on the bridge plate and on the neck plate on the Telecasters and basses. This is the general outline of these early guitars, but there were lots of non-cataloged models with custom features, something that would carry forward with Fender Japan throughout their history, right up until the present day. These made-in-Japan instruments were intended for the domestic Japanese market, but were also exported to Europe. As Fender USA guitars were also being exported to Europe, this created a good deal of confusion there. So late in '82, Fender decided to use the Squier brand name on their instruments distributed outside of Japan. Fender had owned the Squier name since 1965 when they acquired what was then an ailing guitar string company with that name. I reached out to TrueFire to be my sponsor because I've used them for years. Curling and having fun with my buddy Jeff McErlane's Solo Explorer course. With over 2 million users worldwide, whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or advanced level player, TrueFire has lessons to enhance and inspire your playing. Get 35% off courses using the promo code 5watt35, or like I do, sign up for the All Access Pass to use the entire TrueFire catalog. I really like TrueFire, and I think if you give them a shot, you'll like them too. Sign up now to start your journey to being a better guitarist. I'd like to thank TrueFire for their support in making this video. Although the original plan was to have the Japanese production for the overseas markets only, Fender was realizing that they needed to bring a lower price point for the US market. Dan Smith recalled that they did everything they could think of to produce a lower priced line in the States, but they just couldn't figure out a way to get below the $500 point for a Telecaster. For example, by late in '83, a Japanese-produced Squier Telecaster became available in the US at a list price of $369. At the time, the American Telecaster was listed as $589. For this reason, and some others that we'll come to, the Japanese Squiers were brought to the US. By 1984, all the red ink had convinced CBS to sell, and they worked out a purchase by a group of investors headed by Bill Schultz. It was announced at the January '85 NAMM show and finalized that March. The reported $12.5 million deal included the Fender name and distribution company. But the new owners didn't have the money to buy the Fullerton factory, which over time was now sitting on some very expensive real estate. So the factory itself was not part of the package. So until they could set up a new factory space, the company sold imports and old stock. By '85, the company had moved its headquarters to Brea, California, and had contracted Korean factories to begin making the Squier instruments for the U.S. market. The massive Fullerton factory had had a staff of 700 people, but the new management imagined a lower production numbers of higher quality guitars, so brought the staff down to, at first, 200, and then all the way down to 110 by the time the Fullerton factory closed. After exploring many options, Schultz decided that the only thing to do was to move to a new factory for American Fenders. They found a space in Corona, California. While transitioning between the factories, they slashed prices on the remaining U.S. inventory and added a large number of the Fender Japan instruments to the catalog to have something to sell. By October of '85, Fender was in the new factory in Corona and was finally ready to build Fender USA guitars again. Still, production ramped up slowly, and the Japanese guitars in the catalog helped the company bridge this time. It is not correct, as many have implied, that guitars sold under the U.S. name at that time were built in Japan. Rather, parts left over in the U.S. were shipped to Japan to be integrated in the production of the Japanese guitars across that period. This was already common practice at the higher level of the Japanese Fenders, having pickups and pots from Fullerton. So this simply was an expansion of that practice. By the late '80s, the exchange rate shifted in favor of American-made exports, and they increased production in Corona. The original 14,000 square foot plant in 1985 grew to 80,000 square feet by 1990. In time, a plant was also established in Ensenada, Mexico. Originally set up to make the more budget lines, Ensenada also took on finish work that ran afoul of the ever-increasingly stringent air quality laws in California. Parts on guitars labeled American might come from Ensenada, and parts on guitars labeled Mexico might well have come from Corona from the '80s to the present. In 1987, to meet demand from players, Fender created a custom-designed guitar and manufacturing facility, headed by well-known Austin, Texas luthier and vintage repair expert Mike Stevens, and along with former R&D director John Page, they established the Fender Custom Shop at a facility adjacent to the factory in Corona. Originally set up to produce one-off examples as well as customized standard models, their mission was soon expanded to small production runs of limited edition instruments. And this brings us back to Fender Japan history in the context of Fender US. Fully a year before Fender USA, Fender Japan had created their own custom shop, running from '86 to 1994. From '88 to '91, an X-Trad, or Extra Traditional logo, was on the back of the headstock. This changed to a Custom Edition stamp from '92 to '94. The FJ Custom Shop was run by Makoto Nick Sugimoto, who had been working in R&D at the FujiGen factory for the previous 20 years. These one-off guitars were the equivalent of the best of the U.S. custom shop offerings. Like the highest level earlier guitars, they had the same hardware, plastic, and pickups as their American vintage line, along with a nitro lacquer finish. We don't have specific numbers, but it seems that the production of this Japanese custom shop was much more limited than that of its counterpart in the U.S. The final one-off guitars were the order-made guitars. They had non-standard features and lots of custom colors or unique pickup options, essentially anything the customer could dream up. So they might be features that were never made anywhere else. The order-made program of Fender Japan was indicative of the high level of creativity we see in the Fender Japan early years. This history was then carried on by the many short-run instruments made in recent years by Fender Japan. One of the confusing wording differences about Fender Japan guitars is the language "made in Japan" versus "crafted in Japan" stamped on the back of the neck. FujiGen instruments were all labeled "made in Japan," and it was decided that the guitars built by Gakki would be labeled "crafted in Japan." So there's actually an overlap between the made in Japan and crafted in Japan guitars built between '92 and '96. The FujiGen contract ended in '96, and Gakki took over all production at that time, continuing with the crafted in Japan era. The crafted in Japan language was then dropped in 2008. It was at that point that the made in Japan language was brought back, even though it was Gakki who continued to build the guitars. Around 2010, Fender Japan did some very unusual and now highly collectible models during this second Made in Japan era, like thin-line Jazzmasters and floral models instead of the classic Paisleys. In 2015, the relationship with Yamano and Kanda Shokai ended, and Fender USA began overseeing production of their own guitars in Japan at the Gakki factory under the name Made in Japan. It is these guitars that we are now seeing more integrated in the US and American-made guitars now. In 2022, a new line labeled the JV Modified range was introduced. 2 Strats and 2 Telecasters with a semi-historical approach to their spec. This new line of guitars is again being built by FujiGen, the first time Fender Japan has had FujiGen building their guitars since 1996. I spent the last 2 months playing a 2023 JV Modified custom Telecaster from Fender Japan. These are inspired by the original JV guitars of the early 80s. They even use a JV prefix in the serial numbers. Like many of the more creative runs of Fender Japan guitars, these instruments often mix and match specs from different eras while also adding modern specs as well. For example, you'll find a soft V neck on all 4 2022 model guitars, including those with a slab rosewood neck. The soft V-style neck is associated with the mid to late 50s one-piece maple necks, and the slab rosewood fingerboard ran from 59 to 62, but here they are, stirred together. And very fittingly, the guys at Mike and Mike's Guitar Bar were kind enough to lend me an original 84 JV 60s style Stratocaster that you've seen Jeff Mackerling playing in the video. I really like this guitar, and if it wasn't for the period-specific 60s style frets being so low, I'd probably own it now. I just got lost in that candy apple red finish. There aren't a lot of these Fender Japan guitars in the US, but with the new arrangement, Fender is bringing many more of them here. I'd encourage you to turn to the guys at Mike and Mike's Guitar Bar for the ultimate level of knowledge if you want to find a great used one from any era. This isn't a paid ad of any kind. I've simply learned that Mike and company are the most knowledgeable shop I know when it comes to Fender Japan production. If I missed your favorite part of the Fender Japan story, please put it in the comments for everyone to enjoy. I know from experience that I can count on you. If you enjoyed this short history, then you'll probably like my recent video on the top 20 Stratocaster players that changed the world. First, I need to thank Mike Ball and all the guys at Mike and Mike's Guitar Bar in Seattle for providing me with many of the details in this video. I need to thank Jeff Mackerling for helping us get ready. With his playing on the original 84 JV Stratocaster. I used 2 books to pull together the broader strokes of this history, Richard Smith's Fender, The Sound Heard Round the World, and A.R. Duchessoir's The Fender Telecaster. Both are worth your time in getting to know more about Fender history. I want to thank everyone that stopped by the store and picked up a hat or a hoodie or the Stomp preset pack. And in particular, I need to thank the Friends of 5 Watt on Patreon. It's the guitar community I've always wanted. You're all 5 Watt world. I just make the videos. If you enjoyed this short history of Fender Japan, hit the like button. And if you hadn't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that too on your way out. Thanks for hanging with me until the end. Until next time, this is Keith Williams. Thanks for being a part of the 5 Watt world.